in general, these are a couple of the other minor points they're talking about. So they're talking about mandatory registration and licensing for all landlords. So this was the sort of national landlord register that they're talking about. Some councils run this now, but there's no national database. They're talking about a national database of landlords. This doesn't extend to the rogue landlord database that's been talked about for years but never really happened. But they're talking about landlords having to register. No doubt there will be some fee for registration. Usually with requirements like this, if you are with a letting agent, it's the letting agent that registers, not the individual landlord, for example. So if you're a client with us, it wouldn't be required of the individual landlord. But there is talk of this national register so that landlords can be required to register themselves. I suspect that will be multi-benefit. It will help councils find landlords quicker. I've no doubt the council tax system would use it, and I suspect HMRC would use it to check that you are declaring your income. That's just me being suspicious, but it makes sense that all of those things would be tied together, because why wouldn't they? But that I don't think it's a major problem for us, but there's talk obviously of this national register. There's always talk of penalties and increased penalties for non-compliance, but in fairness, those exist now. So, there's a raft of legislation that if me as an agent or a private landlord breach, there are fines up to £30,000. The worst offences would carry prison sentences. So the penalties are there, frankly, but in general, there's this sort of warmth towards increasing those. Really, I think actually they just need to be better policed, and the people who flout them repeatedly need to be dealt with. But in general, there's this push for there being more penalties and sort of more action against landlords who don't comply. So in terms of sort of preparation, I always recommend that landlords make local authorities aware of any properties that they self-manage in an area. If nothing else, because it will get you on that council's mailing list. So for example, if a council implemented selective licensing in an area, they would actively directly inform you. I'll speak briefly about this because Durham, the area where we operate most, so County Durham, has a selective licensing scheme. Many of you online will be aware of it, I'm sure. But recently it was announced that there are 29,000 homes affected by that scheme. And 2.5 years into the 5-year scheme, roughly half of the 29,000 haven't yet applied for a licence. So as a landlord who paid vastly for licences and abides by all of the sort of requirements and works hard to make sure we do everything we can to abide by the requirements, it's quite frustrating for me that sort of half of that scheme those landlords haven't registered. So one of my next event probably will be to try and target landlords out there who don't know about selective licensing, because I think there are two categories really, in fairness. There are some landlords who legitimately will not know that licensing exists in Durham or that they're meant to sort of abide by it. And then there are others who just aren't interested. So we'll probably do some promotional work in coming months, because there's 13,000 landlords approximately out there who just haven't applied. So I guess for me, we'd like to attract the ones who innocently haven't applied, who were well-meaning, and we could assist them to apply for licenses, get them compliant and move forward with them. But as a general point, there will be more licensing and requirements from councils. So a really good thing to do is to approach each council where you have properties, let them know the addresses that you manage, get you into their database. They normally do newsletters, things that are happening. Sometimes they do have grants and nice things to tell you about. But if there's anything you need to do, it means they tell you, rather than you perhaps being blind to what's going on. So that's a sort of easy, quick tip that could be done, just to get in touch with any councils where you operate. Obviously, applying for any licenses. I know Gateshead Council are proposing to extend their selective licensing, and Newcastle Council also, they're proposing to extend their scheme. So there's that, and the huge scheme in Durham, 29,000. So if anyone was unsure about whether the properties needed a licence, you could email myself, and we have means to check postcodes, or you can do it through the council's own website, but certainly it's something we could help with. But it's almost worth doing an audit, frankly. In In fact, Lewis, this is a job that you've helped with previously, where we will print. Yeah. As a letting agent, it's a really tedious job, unfortunately, but we would print every single address and check it off against the council's website, because the last thing I want to do is miss an address, because that could trigger a fine. And when we're dealing with 250, it could easily be done. So poor Lewis has done this for me before, where I've said, there's a full list of postcodes. Let's check one by one. I need to check that we've applied for everything we should. But as a landlord, it's worth doing that exercise. Just double checking with every council area that they haven't or aren't proposing any selective licensing in those areas. Because it is a bit of a minefield. There's so much going on. Councils often aren't great at publicising these things. And to be fair, if you're a private landlord at the other end of this country, legitimately you just might not hear about it and might be naive to it. So it's a really good thing to sort of register, or maybe get us to check your postcodes.
Some questions. There's one on one of the earlier points from Paul. If you have tenants on below market rent and they refuse to leave on the Section 21 notice, can you put up the rent to the market rent, which will likely result in them in arrears, to evict them on arrears on a Section 8?
Yes, although I think I would do that in stages. So once a Section 21 has been issued, I wouldn't increase the rent. So I think if we did that in stages, I would do the rent increase first and then initiate a Section 8 notice. I wouldn't increase rent whilst a Section 21 is pending, if that makes sense. I think if you were seeking possession under a Section 21, I would probably... Sadly, it would end up in court. Eventually, you would get possession, but I think if you would already commence Section 21, I would go, in effect, follow that process through. If no notices have been served, to me, it would be a matter of correcting the rent level. They either pay or they don't. If rent arrears accrue, then absolutely you have the Section 8 route to rely upon, or the new route, whatever that's called in the future. But I believe it is dangerous to make Section 21, because it's kind of counterproductive, isn't it? If we'd issued a Section 21, what we're saying to the tenant is we want to end the tenancy. So to then say we now want to put your rent up is a bit, frankly, confusing. And I think a court would find that confusing, and I think it could almost be construed as a forced or retaliatory eviction. If it was like, we want to evict you and now we're going to put your rent up, I think they would have to be done in the right stages at the right time.
Yeah, and Tony has one. He's basically asking, is there anyone in Parliament we can actually bring like certain questions to, which can question Labour on these choices? Basically, he said they seem to come up with an idea and just make it law.
Do you know, we've had so many housing ministers that I can't remember the name of the current Labour housing minister, to be fair, because there'd been so many. I think what's happened, in my opinion, I think the renters reform bill as the Conservatives had has formed the basis of what's about to happen. But what's happened, the politically appealing things that won votes, that were popular with tenants, those bits have been extracted. Let's get rid of no-fault evictions, let's stop uncontrollable rent increases. All those politically favourable things have been fast-tracked. In my opinion, renters reform had more force, and I think some of that thought's been lost in haste, which is a bit of a risk for us, frankly. Some of the things we've drawn upon this evening that seem to have disappeared. And it's a bit of a shame. The thought of modernising the courts was a really sensible step in that chain of events, and that's disappeared. There's other things that have disappeared. So, yeah, I suspect some of these they do say, don't they, the Labour government has no money, so what can they do? They can bring about new legislation, because it doesn't cost anything. And if they do things that are popular, that will make them popular. So I think that's kind of where we are, isn't it? They're fast-tracking through things that will make them popular to the tenant base. Sadly, I think some of the logic's been lost. But we'll make the best of it. And I guess, tonight and the work we'll do is about making the best of it.
And there's no more questions.
Okay. It's a mixed bag of good news and bad. So some of this sort of goes over what we've said, but always this, in terms of risks for landlords, but always this higher risk of fine, penalties. The there are so many powers for councils presently that the risk is ever present, but there will be a drive, I'm sure, from councils to increase their presence and increase fines, frankly. It's a bit of a, politically it's favourable, it's a press winner, and it's an income generator. So we kind of need to be ready, and we need to have our sort of ship in order, which is mainly around property condition. But I think some of the things I say about preparation there, sort of familiarising yourself with the new penalties. I'm speaking to the converted because you guys are already here on the training tonight, sort of trying to get ahead of the curve and being proactive. Some of the things we've talked about tonight about being proactive, you know, thinking about, do we have the right tenants, and is there anybody where tenancies need to be ended? Thinking about rent levels. Definitely getting inside properties and checking how tenants live, how tenants behave, and property condition, because if a landlord was to end up in trouble, it is often over property condition. So that is definitely one where, you know, now is the time to sort of to get on top of that and make any improvements that you need to make if we're going to avoid anything too disastrous later. So these are sort of my checklists. Reviewing, updating tenancy agreements and making sure tenants have the right paperwork in place. This is the other area where councils can sort of catch this out. This is much more of an administrative process, to be honest. I will come at the end. We have a sort of free compliance check offer where we will go through with landlords our compliance checklist, and we'll check that landlords have done and issued everything they need to for a tenancy. That's normally about a 45-minute Zoom call where we will meticulously just go through that checklist, ask you guys as landlords at the other end, it's one by one, but ask you to have your paperwork sort of to hand, and we would literally check off what has been done, has it been done correctly at the right time. Usually from that comes an action plan, so any errors can be corrected. That is sort of one of the later slides where we offer that for landlords. So I shall come back to that at the end, but definitely I think now that is a wise thing to do. I think it's all about just making sure that we have all of our ducks in a row and everything as it should be. So that's the administrative one. Definitely looking at property inspections and any improvements that need to be made. So firstly, we get the admin right. Secondly, we get the fabric of the property correct, so that if a council goes in tomorrow, there is very little or nothing for them to find, because that is a far better position than them finding things and having to come back to you, because that's when action can follow. Definitely staying informed about the changes, which I know you guys are obviously doing because you've taken the time to be with us here tonight. The little bit I mentioned there about registering with councils and making sure they're aware of the properties you have so that they can keep you informed because of sort of new requirements that are popping up all the time. Selective licensing is a big one. So it's something we can do for people, or you can do it direct with the council, but definitely let councils know what properties you have and in what area. So these were my big takeaways.